Welcome, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sana Abdelkarim. I'm a fellow at the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We are here today and my pronouns is she and her. We're here today for Healing the Wounded Healers webinar with Richard Smith. I will place some logistical information on the chat for you all. Just give me a minute. We have today available live captioning. So if you need that, please hit the live that. Hopefully you can see it. If you have any technical issues, please write to us on the chat. I have my colleague Selena Bennett Chamber, our policy director, who would help us with navigating some of these issues if we have them throughout. And sorry, I'm trying to slow down for the interpretation. Yeah, so we can start. Our speaker for today is Richard Smith. I'm really grateful for him to give us some time and show us some of his work and teachings today. Richard is nationally recognized expert on trauma and healing for survivors and of interpersonal and systemic violence. He has over 2 decades of experience developing and leading community-based organizations and programs. He's also helped organizations throughout the country to build their capacity to heal and empower Black, Indigenous, and people of color and marginalized communities. He's the founder and lead strategist and anti-racism educator for Richard Smith Speaks LLC. Richard also is an assistant professor at LIU Brooklyn in Socials Work Department. He is a guest lecturer in numerous colleges and universities on issues such as systemic racism, mass incarceration, trauma, and healing. Richard also serves as a national director of United for Healing Equity and Common Justice. He holds a master's degree from the University at Albany in African Studies, and he is presently a doctoral candidate at SUNY Albany School of Social Work. His research focuses on male survivors of childhood sexual assault and abuse. Richard is Robert Wood Johnson Forward Promise Fellowship for Leaders and 2018 Fellow. He's a proud dad of Caden and Caleb. And so welcome, Richard. The floor is yours. You can share your screen. And again, everyone, if you have any technical issues, just write in the chat for us and we can try to help you with that.
Hello, everyone. How do I sound? Am I loud and clear?
You're perfectly clear.
Thank you. This is so interesting for me. I love, I've been doing the Zoom sessions for a while, even before COVID, and we kind of all like shifted in that direction. It's always good to see people's faces and to do things in community. That's the way that I operate. And so not seeing anyone is something new for me, but I would love for you all to chime in and ask your questions via chat or any thoughts or ideas that come to mind. First, I want to thank Ms. Costa for giving me this opportunity to share some of my experiences, some of my knowledge, the things that I've learned along my journey, and be able to share with some folks that I know, especially under the current conditions, all of the things that's happening in our society, that's happening in our world, and thinking about, unfortunately, all the loss, all of the anger, all of the rage, all of the sadness, all of the pain, all of the trauma that people are feeling right now. So I know it takes a lot to show up. And so I just ask that if, I appreciate your participation in this session and this opportunity for us to come together. But most importantly, just care for yourself as much as you possibly can. If there's anything that, activates you in a way, please take care of yourself, because that's, to me, is the most important thing about this work. because as we do this work in various capacities, we're really relying on our bodies, we're relying on our spirits, our minds, and our emotions to guide us through this process. And so I'm going to share my screen. This would be good. So the title of this session and this conversation is Healing Wounded Healers. And it is a title that came to me based on a few things. In addition to all of the ways that Santa described me as far as the work is concerned, and my credentials, the thing that I have been aware of, but did not have the language to describe all along, is that I am a wounded healer. I am someone who is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, someone who's a survivor of violence, proximity violence, violence that's happened in my community. I'm a survivor of the war on drugs and mass incarceration, being someone who was formerly incarcerated. Um, and so I have wounds, like unfortunately too many people, specifically too many Black and brown people in our society have. Um, but I am also someone who has been very fortunate to encounter people who have been able to support me throughout my journey and helping me to realize and actualize the ways in which I can use the wounds. I can grow from those wounds. I can extract information and knowledge and compassion from those wounds in a way that I can support the healing journey of other folks who are either committed to doing this work, but also folks who are just impacted by various systems of oppression in society. And so this particular session is really personal for me because I've been very fortunate enough to work with a lot of organizations throughout the country. In my role as the national director for United for Healing Equity at Common Justice, which is an alternatives to incarceration organization, as well as a victim services organization based out of Brooklyn, where we operate the first alternatives to incarceration program in the country to work with young people who've been charged with violent crimes in the adult courts. My role over the last 4 years has been more outward facing, initially leading the effort to shift the narrative around the impact of trauma and violence on the lives of boys and men of color, and then communities of color as a whole, and the significance and importance of healing and investing in that healing that shows in which the trauma shows up differently because of so many other things that I'll cover here. But in these experiences and in the opportunities that I've had to be able to work with other folks, what I've found is that there's so many people out there who are doing this work who are driven by their own personal experiences of harm and trauma. And it's what drives them, it's what gives them the capacity to identify, relate, to empathize, to show the compassion, the same type of compassion my trauma and my wounds have allowed me to show. But I've also found that too often the folks who come into this work um, with those experiences um, can do a lot to support others, but oftentimes we neglect our own continuous healing journey. And so what I've found is that so many people um, who are doing this work are doing it at the expense of their own healing, at the expense of their own joy. Um, and what I believe is that that doesn't have to be the case, that we can continue to do the work that's important to us, that gives us a sense of purpose, identity in a lot of instances, in a way where we can support the healing journey of others and simultaneously be equally as committed to our continuous healing journey. And so this concept of healing wounded healer is something that I came across um, originally from Carl Jung. And this quote here kind of captures what he meant by it, and that that the person who is the analyst must go on learning endlessly. It is his or her their own hurt that gives him the measure of his power to heal. This and nothing else is the meaning of the Greek myth of the wounded physician or wounded healer. And what I found is that in addition to Jung's interpretation, there were these archetypes that existed um, in different cultures that represented that same wounded healer uh, symbolism or archetype. That person who uses the pain in their own wounds as fuel and knowledge and insight to support the healing journey of so many others. Um, a little bit more complex than that is like the myth of Piran, who was this centaur and a teacher and a physician and a wounded healer himself, who the centaurs were very aggressive, but he was much more sensitive and gentle. And a lot of folks turned to Kiran for um, support and education. And he was wounded at one point, and the wound was irreparable. And he could not heal himself, but he could heal so many other people. And he was committed to that. And this is a myth, but I also think that it symbolizes, for me, many of the folks that we're seeing, especially those who are out on the front line doing this work to support the healing journey of other folks. And so this is an image of some brothers that I know that are doing work in which we call like credible messengers, cure violence, outreach workers. These are folks that are doing work who have been directly impacted by the same systems of oppression. Many survivors of gun violence, formerly incarcerated, experience some of the struggles and trauma that's associated with the culture of what some folks call gangs. But they have turned around their pain, they've turned their pain and their trauma into sources of support and healing and for other folks who are out in the community. So to me, these represent, and this is just one example, but this is an example of, what, wounded healers look like today in this era. And I'm sure many of you on this, on this webinar are quite familiar. If not, this is something that resonates with you because you can identify with this experience as well. So I just wanted to go over quickly a couple things that I'm gonna cover. But again, as I stated initially, if you have a question, if something comes to mind that you want to chime in with, because like I said, I'm a communalist. I thrive off of connection. I thrive off of brainstorming and collective ideas and knowledge sharing and all of that good stuff. It's the ways in which I learn the most. It's the ways in which I've healed the most. And I think the ways in which I've been able to make any kind of contributions to this work. Um, And so a few of the things that we're going to cover, which are things that I cover when I do this training directly with folks who are wounded healers, who are credible messengers, who are cure violence workers. Um, a lot of the folks that I work with were in Brooklyn, in New York City, in Harlem. I've also worked with folks in Detroit, um, folks in Little Rock, Arkansas, folks in Washington, D.C., in Flint, Michigan. Uh, and, one of the things that comes off as being like one of the most important things to cover is um, we think about this work in the context of the ways in which we can support others. And similar to what I was saying earlier, I start from the foundation, right, to help folks understand the impact of trauma on them, various forms of trauma, right, and how that shows up in our bodies. Because again, going back to what I stated initially, like when we do this work, what we bring to this work is ourselves. Even those who haven't been directly impacted. And my personal view is that if you are a person of color in this country, you've experienced some sort of trauma, some sort of traumatic event. As long as white supremacy, as long as patriarchy, as long as any anti-blackness, even if you haven't directly been impacted by it, when you cut on the news and you see, Deshaun Wright being killed, when you see Philando Castillo being killed in front of his daughter, when you see George Floyd being killed, when you see any um, instances which are too many um, taking place, and now in this era in which we have access to all of this information via video, um, it affects you, right? And so it's important for us to understand and be mindful of how this affects us, and how this shows up in our bodies, um, and then how that shows up in our when it's after it shows up in our bodies. How does that affect the way that we approach this work? How does it affect the way that we interact and relate to other people who are close to us, in addition to just the work? Our partners, our children, our friends, and obviously our colleagues. And so the way that I start is typically helping people to think about it, think about the neuroscience of trauma. And I'm a fan of Dr. Bruce Perry's work, The Boy Who Was Raised Like a Dog, um, Vessel van der Kolk's work, those folks who are able to add a neurological perspective and insight to the ways in which trauma shows up in our bodies. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar, but you'd be surprised that folks who are like just really committed to doing this work, not thinking about it, on a personal level, right? And that's what's so beautiful about wounded healers and folks who are doing this work that I've been able to connect with, is that oftentimes they're not even thinking about themselves. It's a selfless effort, right? It's heart-based work, right? It's purpose, right? Um, like myself, someone for many years who was considered to be a throwaway, not worthy of, right? Not deserving of, to find a sense of purpose in the way that I can share my experiences and my pain to support others, um, is something that means a lot to us, right? And so we get caught up in that and we forget about the way that it shows up in our own bodies. And so the neurosequential model of therapeutics, it's just a way of understanding that, and to understand that, that this trauma that we experience is not something that's just psychological. It's not something that's just emotional. It's a whole body effect that it has on us. And it's not only just a whole body as an individual, but it's a whole body experience as a collective. And we'll talk more about that as we look at like intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. Um, and so, let me see a question in here. Have you written any books in your field? Oh, someone asked if I've written any books. I have not written any books in my field, um, but I'm actually working on something. Let me see again. Like I said, I love the question. Hmm. Okay, no questions. So this image is something that I got from Bruce Perry's work that really captures how the trauma um, processes through our body based on that model that I showed you, and you saw the quote from the neurotransmission sequential model, um, where you see how you know trauma impacts us at a lower level, at a brainstem, the area that controls like the basic functioning to the extent where, if you've been exposed to something traumatic, um, some of the higher level functioning that we expect people to be able to engage in um, are compromised because it takes away from your capacity to access those because of the trauma. And I say this because I think it's important when you think about, and we all have seen this, right? If you work with young people, adults, who have you, whoever has experienced trauma, you know that like the way in which we oftentimes have expectations for folks to function in ways that really at a particular time they may not even have the capacity to do, right? Because that lower level part of the brain has been compromised in a way that their focus is kind of stagnated and stuck at that particular point. And so I often share this, not, I share this because I think it helps us to understand sometimes behavior. It helps us to understand behaviors that are sometimes inexplicable, right? Like when you're asking a young person to, um, show up for a job opportunity that you work so hard to support them with as a case manager or as a social worker, or and then you find out that that young person is not showing up. That person is not showing up for that job. Um, and that person spoke to you in your office or when you saw that person and they said that they really needed a job. And you're just like, but why didn't you show up? Right. And I think this kind of captures the ways in which folks may be stagnant and not even be able to articulate what's going on with them. But I think it's important for us to know that and to take that into consideration when we're assessing situations. But then, as it relates to this particular training session here, it's important for us to think about it as it relates to ourselves, right? When we find ourselves making commitments and maybe falling short of those commitments because we turn on the news and we see something, or because something happened um, last night to a friend or a loved one that kind of activated us in ways that compromises our ability to function normally um, as we would. And it's important for us to think about the way that trauma impacts us. Um, and so, when I do the work with folks who are like direct service folks, I bring this up to really kind of ground us in that understanding. I'm gonna skip through some of this. And this is just really just um, the breakdown of the neurosequential development, that model. And it just says, it breaks down how, the brain develops in a sequential fashion, um, and how it, as this information is being received, especially as if we're younger people who've experienced trauma, and how that can compromise long-term ways in which um, we have the capacity to operate in ways that folks may have expectations for us, and also ourselves. Why is it that we find ourselves doing certain things that we know are not right and are not consistent with what we say we desire? And it's more than just like habitual habit or pattern, or just not exercising self will or self discipline, which I think we oftentimes result to, and all of that becomes like shaming messages that we probably have received before, and now they're messages that we repeat in our head, um, as we try to understand ways in which we're not following through or coming through, to do the things that we say we want to do, or accomplish the things that we say we want to accomplish. And I'll say this too, like for all of this, for me, like it's really about this knowledge about neuroscience. Without, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not. What it did for me, and what I hope it does for anyone, is that it opens up a space for us to be able to show self-compassion, right? To understand, there are going to be times that our capacity is going to be compromised, right? And so that way we can show ourselves compassion, because I do believe that if you can't show yourself compassion, um, it's going to be really impossible for us to do that for others, right? In an authentic way. Um, so I'm going to stop here and see something in the chat. Yes. Um, this is also something I get from Dr. Perry, that is so like critical to this work, but also very essential when we think about the ways in which we show up, right? And these three R's: regulate, relate, reason. And what I found is that, for folks who are wounded healers who are doing this work and supporting other people, oftentimes, because we come with that lived experiences, because we have shared similar experiences of harm, of trauma, of incarceration, of gun violence, of CSA, sexual, like we come into it with the eagerness to relate, and then from that relationship that we establish, we then try to reason. But that process is not always effective if the regulation hasn't occurred. And I think that's another critical piece about understanding the neuroscience and the way that trauma impacts our bodies, is that the first phase is really to help a person regulate, especially if they're activated. And we know that when we're doing this work, um, working with young people who've experienced violence, young people who've experienced trauma, um, either directly or vicariously, that they're often activated. And then, more importantly, for the sake of this conversation, we have to think about, how do we regulate ourselves, right? How do we regulate ourselves, because we're constantly engaged in conversations and, relationships with these young people, with the people that we work with directly, who are experiencing trauma, especially those of us who've experienced similar types of trauma, that may look really close to what we've dealt with in our lives. And so, how are we making sure that we are regulating ourselves? Um, so that, and this goes to this next piece, and all of us have heard this quite often, right? Vicarious trauma, um, and knowing that this affects us too. The work that we do is affecting us as well, and keeping that in perspective. The sad part about it, from my experience, is that the folks who are doing the direct service work, the outreach workers, the credible messengers, the cure violence folks, um, I don't know if you're in the Albany area, like the snug folks, like the folks who are doing, that direct work, who have those lived experiences, who are the wounded healers, um, right? They're oftentimes the people, who are exposed to the most and have the least amount of privilege and opportunity, um, to support themselves. All right. I've seen in too many instances that these vital, like, people in our communities who are committed to like quelling violence and intervening in violence, and preventing retaliation and further harm, and like doing an amazing job of literally putting their bodies in the way, um, working part-time, right? And then having to have a full-time job doing something else, or not being able, basically not being compensated the way that they need to be compensated, so that they can create space, or there could be space allotted for them, to think about the ways in which the trauma they're continuing to experience this trauma vicariously, as well as ways that they can care for themselves. Or what I believe is more important than self-care is, where we can create communities of care for each other. But that takes time. And if you're not compensated to the point where you have to work multiple jobs for the sake of just providing for you and your family, and let's think about this, right? Oftentimes, the folks who are doing that work, directly, are folks who have been impacted by these systems of oppression the most, and so oftentimes working at a deficit, right? If you're a formerly incarcerated person and you've served 15 years in prison. And now you're out here working and doing something that's really meaningful and important for you. Um, but still, we have to account for the fact that this person lost 15 years of wages, right? This person, was not able to like develop, a savings, or do all of the things that many of you and us have been able to do, throughout the 15 years to put ourselves in a better position. And so these folks are oftentimes starting from a deficit. I know how it felt for me, coming out and after spending 10 years of my life incarcerated, and feeling like, I had to play catch up. And what catch up looked like for me was just working nonstop and going to school nonstop. And I know that that's typical. I know that a lot of folks on here who are not directly impacted, not formally incarcerated, who say that they've done the same thing, and I get it. Um, but there's something when you're feeling like it's not like you're doing it because you're moving forward in a way that you see opportunities being produced from your hard work, but you're moving in a way where you're trying to compensate for all of these years that you've lost. So it creates this like intense type of need, um, to not stop, to not say no to any invitation, to any opportunity, to do this work. Um, I have a comment in here that I want to share. I think this ties to white dominant culture also, to perform and deliver under any circumstance. Self-care, compassion, community healing is not typically prioritized. And that's exactly it. Um, and so I'm going to skip through this because I feel like, many of us on here know what this means. One point that I want to make about the way that, this definition of vicarious trauma, and specifically as it relates to wounded healers or folks who have been directly impacted, um, is burnout makes sense, right? Like the average person, if you're overwhelmed, you can feel like compassion fatigue, because this is not to take away from folks who have not been directly impacted, right? Because, either way, we are really committed to doing this work that is demanding and taxing emotionally, spiritually, physically of our bodies. Um, but one of the things that I emphasize is that, for folks who are directly impacted, formerly incarcerated, and I've seen this way too many times, it's not a matter of burnout. It's oftentimes crash and burn, um, because so much is riding on our success. So much is riding on, um, our ability to do this work in a way that adds credibility to who we are and the contribution that we can make to society, especially those of us who have felt like, um, we didn't make any contributions before this, right? And we feel a sense of obligation, right? I talk to so many folks who are credible messengers, cure violence folks, direct service folks, And they're just like, they feel like they can't take a moment off because if they do, like someone's going to be killed. And so I hear it all the time, folks saying like, my cell phone is always on 24/7. There's no time that a young person can't reach me. There's no time that this person can't reach me. Um, and so there's so much like there's so much more riding on that, especially when it's associated with your identity, um, and your sense of value. In a society that for so long didn't consider you to be valuable, right? See a couple statements in the crowd. Hmm. Yeah, 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 yeah. Um, so what was this here? Michelle said, performing under any circumstances and to any degree necessary can be perceived or in ways that risk our own lives can be interpreted as badges of honor in our work with survivors. Absolutely, right? And so that's the piece, right? Because even if you think about folks who have the best models and programs and the ones who are like um, praised for their efforts, I've been fortunate to be able to connect with some of those folks, and you hear them and they say the same thing, like the fact that they're always on, the fact that they never let their cell phones go off, and like um, that is like reinforcing that, right? It's saying it's a badge of honor, and then it's reinforced with recognition, um, and things that make us feel good. But at what expense? Um, I see Mo saying that I don't think that there's enough attention paid to how the trauma of incarceration impacts folks who are trying to reconnect back with their families and communities. Um, that's absolutely right. And I think, for me, and based on my experiences, both professionally and personally, that um, I think more emphasis needs to be on the amount of trauma that we experience prior to going to being incarcerated. Oftentimes, our responses, the behaviors that we engage in, are products of or results of unaddressed trauma. Um, Things that we've experienced before incarceration, that in our society, and this is something that I often talk about, it's like we pathologize Black and Brown suffering and pain, um, to the extent that we don't really look at Black and Brown pain or behaviors that are symptomatic of trauma, unaddressed trauma, as being, we punish those, we criminalize those behaviors instead of asking, what happened to you with this shift in trauma informed everything now, right? We say, what's wrong with you? But the fact is that when you think about the experiences of trauma that folks have had, before that, before their incarceration, right? Like what led to that? You think a person just naturally wants to engage in behaviors that, could compromise their life? No judge ever, and quite frankly, I didn't have the wherewithal to be even to even communicate to anyone um, the pain that I experienced as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. You know, I didn't have the language or the ability to communicate to people that the reason why I picked up my first gun was because when I was hanging out with my friends, I was robbed, and we were just hanging out with girls, and that gun being in my face and that sense of powerlessness that I felt um, pushed me in a way that said I will never allow that to happen again. So I took that chance, right, for the sake of defending myself, protecting myself, so that I couldn't experience that traumatic situation ever again. But these are not questions, these are not things that are being considered when we think about the decisions that people make that lead to them being incarcerated. Um, exactly. And so, yes, and that trauma gets criminalized. Um, And so Deborah, hi Deborah, says, I've learned that it is disempowering to interfere with another person's opportunity to process their own pain and sorrow. The problem solving created compassion fatigue. Once I learned to practice self-compassion, I could start sitting in the room and listen. There is no fatigue when listening. Yeah, that's a really excellent point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. One of the things that I often say that's similar to that, Deborah, is that we can only like heal to or support someone's healing journey to the extent that we healed ourselves, right? And so to your point, like how could you show self compassion to others without having self compassion being your primary focus, right? And then the exhaust comes from working doubly hard, right? Because that's what ends up happening. We're working twice as hard um, to process what we're experiencing because we have this stuff that's living in our bodies while simultaneously trying to show up for other people that we're working with. So of course that's exhausting. Of course that can produce compassion fatigue um, because it takes a tremendous amount of labor, emotional labor, um, to do that. And like I was saying earlier, when you couple that with, folks who have been successful in helping other people, and how that gets reinforced as the norm, as a standard for the type of way that we should approach this work, and how that becomes a cyclical, and then at the expense of those same people who we valued, who we learned to value and see what they bring to this work, oftentimes not just burning out, but crashing and burning. Um, and I say that really intentionally because there's so many people that I've seen along the journey that you say to yourself, like, what happened to this person? And we're not even talking about the fact that um, people literally being killed, putting their bodies on the line out here, right? Literally being killed doing this work. And we're not even talking about that, you know? So anyhow, yeah, and that practice of pathologizing and criminalizing is compounded by perceived gender, ability level, etc. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I'm digging all of the chat boxes because it makes me feel like I'm having a conversation, not just jogging. All right. So this is the standard stuff when we talk about, ways that but it's standard. But the thing about it is like, it's interesting. Like, um, one of the reasons why another reason why this even became a thing for me was I was doing these like trauma trainings to like help, advocates and like mental health professionals, credible messengers, folks who are working with survivors do this work. And we would go through this whole day training or half day training. And then at the end of the training, there was like a section that I incorporated for self care. And I was like, wait a minute, like that in itself defeats the purpose. If we get to the end of all of this stuff that we need to take into consideration when we think about the way that we approach the work, and then we get at the end of that, then we start talking about ourselves, which is the most valuable, you know, instrument, that we bring to this work. Um, that in itself is like, it's kind of, it contradicts the statement, right? And so I said, wait a minute, we need to start with that. We need to start with like, what are you doing to support yourself? Like, what are you doing? Um, what are we doing collectively? What is being done at your organization collectively to account for the trauma that you've experienced, right? When we think about the movement and the way that it's shifted to see the value of folks who are directly impacted, and so those folks, us folks, are getting more access to opportunities, even leadership opportunities, but we're not thinking about what that impact is, right? And so That played a major role in me saying like there needs to be something that's just directly focused on them. Um, and I'll say too that this is not something generally new, right? Because if you look at this movement and this work with survivors, like women of color, queer women, trans women, they've been doing this work under the auspice of healing justice for years. I would say that why it's so important for me to bring it out in the way that I am is because when you think about those who are formerly incarcerated, this whole movement to end mass incarceration, folks who are formerly incarcerated who are working with survivors, many of them have these experiences of trauma, and these conversations are not a part of that work in the way that they should be. Healing justice is not a part of that work in the way that it should be. And so, you know, when I start talking about vicarious trauma, not from the perspective of what you need to take into consideration, what we need to take into consideration when working with someone else, but think about how it lives in our bodies. It shifts. Um, yeah, I'm gonna go to the chat again. Um, um, Kyra Akira says if people's comments could be all panelists and attendees, haha. Please make sure to send your okay. That's like a violence across the life course and the impact of oppression. My parents were incarcerated. And this is Gabriella. Parents were incarcerated, and there was a shame that I carried and the fear of becoming a statistic. I think it's because they were immigrants in the environment of Miami, Florida in the 80s. I became an unaccompanied youth at the age of 15 years old, and it was very hard to focus on school and not allow myself to get caught up in the criminal activity in order to survive. Staying in school was very hard. I can recognize how it impacts all aspects of our lives. Now I use it to remind myself of my resilience. As a trauma therapist, I remember those moments and how vulnerable I felt as a young Latina. Um, Wait, was that directly to me? Oh, it was to all panelists. Thank you for sharing that, Gabriella. And you know, I think the other piece that I think is important when I was doing this work that I found to be important, and know is important, is that um, oftentimes we feel like we're the only ones who are experiencing this or feeling these things, right? And sometimes that's why this work is it's a different. It creates a different space to be among people who see you in a way in which, even as adults, even with all of our credentials, um, we don't always know how to explain to other people what we're feeling, um, what we've experienced, right? And then sometimes it's great to just not have to like say a word or two. And then the person just says, yes, I feel you. I can relate, I can identify. To be seen in that way, that in itself is such a huge component of healing, if you ask me, right? To be seen by folks who can relate to what you've been through, but don't see you as the sum total of that. Um, but thank you for sharing that, Gabriella. Um, yeah, what's this here? So Preeti says, I encourage everyone providing direct service to always ask for support when you need it. And if your direct supervisor aren't being helpful, please keep reaching out to people in your organization or network to make sure you get the support, get that support. Your feelings are valid and matter, absolutely. And I also know that that is not always easy. And I'll just be frank. Unfortunately, I think some of these organizations are operating under these same type of corporate models that it might look differently, but it's all about productivity. And that's the influence of capitalism, right? It's about how productive can a person be, um, and and not even take into consideration like long-term productivity, if that's the objective, right? To say that yes, this person needs to have some time, um, to process, or we need to invest more effort in supporting the folks who are doing this work for long-term productivity. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening as much as it should happen, right? It shouldn't be a matter in which someone who's doing direct service should ask that. Um, because again, oftentimes we sacrifice our own well-being for the sake of doing this work and supporting others. And one of the things I often emphasize is like, it's not only just in the professional relationships that we have in our professional capacities. Um, Many of us are the ones who are the most, um, stable emotionally, mentally in our families. We're the ones who are caring for people in our communities, outside of work, in our relationships, even people that we just, see and don't even know. We're always opening up our heart and caring. And so, um, one of the things, sadly, that I've noticed about in this work with folks who are doing it directly, and myself included, is that um, we struggle with caring for ourselves, right? We struggle. And so, when someone asks us, how we're doing, it's oftentimes, I'm good, I'm okay, you know? Um, yeah. And, quite frankly, I've been in situations where, I've asked, I've expressed to people, and this is the other piece too to think about. Um, like I've expressed to people, yeah, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I put in like 12 hours, or a certain amount of hours, and then there's been instances in which people respond to me and says, well, I did 14 hours, or I did 16 hours, right? And so it's like, you know what? Maybe I'm not working as hard, or maybe I need to toughen up and not complain. And so then there's that too reality that we face, right? Um, let me go to the chat for a couple more things. Um, yeah. I see non-profit industrial complex. Yeah, 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 yeah. Um, Alpana. Says, I feel like the organizational culture and structures and funders have stepped up and kept pace with what we know about vicarious trauma and support those most impacted. Yeah, I mean, I think it's changing, and I think it can change even more. Um, and I do think folks are taking note of that. But it depends. It depends on where you're at. You know, being in the Northeast, there's a lot of like privileges we have in knowledge in the ways in which this, people are applying what we know about that to the work. Um, you go in some southern areas that cities, it's not showing up that way. Um, and so I think it's important that we as much as we possibly can, is we use our voices. And it's not just training, it's just like use our voices in general to advocate for that. Um, Especially for those who might not feel like they're in a position to advocate for themselves, right? If you're someone who's just, like newly like released from prison, or you just came out, this is something that came up in a conversation I was having with some colleagues of mine who are also formerly incarcerated. But I think this also relates to survivors in general. And when you show up in this work, and now people are telling me that you're valuable, and that you can make a contribution to something in a positive way. And a lot of times we're just happy to be there, right? And so it's like, I'm just happy to be here. I'm just happy that I'm not like in the same predicament that I was in that led to my incarceration. I just gained this new sense of self-esteem and self-confidence about my value. And so it's like, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that you've given me this opportunity. to use to make meaning out of my experience of trauma and my experiences in a way that can help others, right? And when you're in that state, oftentimes you don't you don't advocate for yourself, right? Because you fear that you might lose this opportunity. We see that with a lot of folks who are formerly incarcerated and survivors. I just recently told someone that I've been home from prison for 16 years, and I never asked for a raise. Um, Never asked for a raise. And when I really thought about that, I was like, why didn't I ask for that? Right? Because it's almost like one is that I'm happy to be here. I'm just happy that there's an opportunity for me to do this. Um, and then there's some of that whole like imposter syndrome, all of that crap that just like this all comes together and like sabotages us being able to advocate for ourselves. So the point I was making is that, for those of us, yes, funders and nonprofits are moving in that direction, but there are people who are not gaining access to that, depending on where you are. And for those of us who have a voice, who have more power and positionality in these organizations, I think it's important for us to advocate for them on their behalf. Kyra talks about the nonprofit industry complex seems to only want to feed itself, not address the inequity, inequality that continues to be perpetrated through the limited ways that nonprofits help and ways to gather funding. I mean, that's absolutely right. One of my friends said that the nonprofit sector is not going to be our ticket to liberation. Um, and I was listening to a colleague of mine who made this point. I think he was referencing someone else, um, but he said, it's really about liberation and not just ending violence, right? And that liberation encompasses that, right? So we don't have to be operating solely from a space of this industry that's surviving based on the benevolence and charity of, a corporation and the amount of profits that they gather, or the way the political pendulum swings and who's in office, right? Because that is not going to be the sole source of our liberation from all of these isms, from white supremacy, from patriarchy, right? To create a more just and equitable society, because it ebbs and flows depending on what the money looks like, what the who's in office. So I appreciate that. Um, yes, we work in, this is Apana, yes, we work in an inherently oppressive structures. Like, how many organizations have policies that employees can do therapy as part, um, go to work hours if needed, and also pay for it? Co-pays can be expensive, absolutely. Um, I was just talking to someone in Chicago that I have a relationship with, and they have a therapist that's on staff that folks can work with directly, not just like for the people that they serve, but for the staff, right? Why isn't that much more the case, right? Um, my supervisor and co-executive director in our organization said something profound to me that I can 100% relate to. I'm not a practitioner in this work. I'm a victim survivor. This has completely changed my way of thinking about the work. Yes, I have the degrees and the experience, but my realities in domestic, sexual, community violence work is that I have lived it firsthand. My expertise in the field comes from that, not the practitioner lens. Yeah, and I think that heightens our ability, and I appreciate that, Michelle. Um, I'm going to stop and I'm going to keep going, but I just want to note that the reason why this is important to me to hear from folks, and not just hear from me, um, and to hear from your colleagues, I think it's important for us to know who the heck is in the room, because the fact is, many of you are going to be working with each other much more than you'll have access to me. Many of you, I hope that folks are able to get to know each other. And if you hear a colleague or someone on here who is saying something, connect with each other. And that way, like, if that person's in your community, y'all can do this work together. Y'all can support each other together. And that's something that I always like hope for whenever it comes to this. not that I say something so profound, but that I say something that could stimulate those types of relationship building, um, that processes that happens that where folks can start to build more community with each other in their respective communities. Um, so, all right, yeah. And so this is a quote from um, one of my colleagues, one of my friends, an elder, Mr. Sam Simmons out of Minnesota. Got to reach out to him today because I'm just make sure everything is all right with that brother. But he says it's history, not pathology. Behavior was adapted to what was happening at the time. Now it's become maladaptive. Beatings were supposed to save lives. I can't tell you why you can't go outside at night because people wanted to hang you. And so we think about this. We also think about Dr. Joy DeGroo's work. Um, when we think about how, in addition to the interpersonal experiences of trauma that we've had in our lives, especially those who are doing the work, again, it's really important for us to think about historical trauma, and to um, think about the role that that plays in the ways in which we experience it, especially as people of color. Um, and how that trauma is transferred, right? And we talk about intergenerational trauma, in addition to historical trauma, and how this is like just this is a it's like a series of these events, traumatic events that are happening to us, um, and you know um, it's a constant. It's not one particular incident. It's a constant. And so today, as Black people, when you still see, like, I was listening to the young lady who was talking at the press conference yesterday, and she was talking about the history of lynching in Minnesota. And the policies that were created, the laws that were created to abolish it, like 100 years ago. But then she said, then we turn on the news and we see multiple other lynchings that are still happening, um, and it's been a constant. It's never been like a moment of reprieve, a moment of ease without um, experiencing or seeing, or hearing about some type of lynching, or hearing about the same type of trauma, um, and harm and violence that's happening to people of color that have been consistent, you know, since this experiment of America and globally. Um, so, um, so this is just a little bit more. I'm gonna stop for a second because I saw some pieces in the chat. Um, let me see here. Michelle, I'm so glad that you're saying this. So many of us are the most stable support within a family system that is still in chaos. This is the first time I've heard, I'm gonna bring that up in conversation. I mean, yeah, and yeah, I appreciate you saying that. But it's just real. Like we have to say that. Um, and this is my personal opinion about like this whole notion of separation of personal and professional. I just feel like that leaves more splintered people, because our personal is definitely going to impact our professional, right? It's definitely going to show up. If there's things that we're dealing with outside of work, it's going to show up. And that's why it's even more dire for us to create communities of care, right? To account for those things, right? And again, like I know that I forgot who it was making the point about how funders and like nonprofits are moving more in that direction to account for the ways in which trauma impact those who are doing the work. Um, and I think that's important. But really, at the end of the day, we have more power and influence than we give ourselves credit for. I'm fortunate to be in quite a few like funding spaces, And people are looking for this information, right? We really should be informing them about what's needed, instead of, like, we should be informing funders and government about what's needed, when it comes to what healing looks like for us, not just for the people that we're serving and working with, but for us as a collective, as folks who, have collectively experienced this, we experience the individual trauma, but the intergenerational trauma, the historical trauma, right? And it's a constant, right? Without an opportunity for, collective grieving, right? And that's the work of, Dr. Braveheart, when, she highlights the importance of unresolved grief, and the importance of being able to grieve, that the losses that we've experienced collectively, um, and to have that be acknowledged, right? Listening to that sister yesterday talk, at that event in the press conference in, Minnesota, I was just like, this, it's grieving. Like, we're constantly grieving. Listening to the mothers, it's like constant, like, collective grieving. And then it's so crazy because then that in itself gets also like, um, like, pathologized. Like, what's wrong with them? Like, understand that we're dealing with, like, decades of trauma and pain, that we've never had an opportunity to grieve, that we've never had an opportunity to fully feel like we've been seen and heard. So yes, it's going to come to a head in instances like this. Yes, it's going to show up in some ways in which people are angry, right? We understand the stages of grief. Those are applicable to collectives. Those are applicable to groups of people, right? And so it might not look like, how we think grieving should look. It might not look like just crying. It might look like tearing some shit up, right? But understand what's the root of that. Um, it's not that people are just maladaptive or antisocial or stuff. It's about the fact that people have experienced a tremendous amount of harm, and they're enraged and they're angry. And that's something that I think is important to take into consideration. And hey, Chris, thank you, Richard, for unveiling all the nuanced ways that we can be more self-aware and kinder to ourselves and one another, in direct contrast to mainstream expectations for constant productivity and competition. Yeah, and that's sort of critical. Like, one of the things I was talking to someone about is like how those of us who are oftentimes, um, accustomed to being the marginalized person, in a space, right? And and then you encounter people, if we're operating from a position of marginalization, from, we show up and we can oftentimes forget, like, other people can be even more marginalized. Those of us who are in leadership roles and organizations, who have credentials, right? But we're like, hey, I'm a Black formerly incarcerated person. But in that organization, your marginalization is also, it's in comparison to other folks who are there, in comparison to that trans person of color, in comparison to that queer Black man who was formerly incarcerated, like, in comparison, like, so it's important for us to think about, and it's hard to think outside of ourselves, but also think about how we can, really be intentional and mindful of, um, recognizing that there are folks who are just right around us, um, who need to be acknowledged in ways and supported in ways, that we may not think about. So here we go. I find that it's easy to normalize how resilient I am in face of trauma, and thereby fail to recognize when I'm fatigued, because I've gone through worse. It's incredibly difficult to practice being gentle with myself when I still feel most normal being under stress. And thank you so much, Kyra, for that, because you definitely captured the reason why I think it's important for us to practice community care. And like I said, this is not something that's new. Um, the women of color have been doing this. Um, and so, but I do think that, that's why we need to just make this universal, right? because sometimes it's going to take a person to say, hey, I know this is a great project and I know you want to be a part of this work. But listen, I know I can handle this. I got this, right? Or let me see if I can get someone else. One of the things I say to people is like, sometimes, and we all know these folks, right? Like myself included, like we're all in it. Like because this work becomes so important to us, right? It's so hard for us to like turn down an opportunity to do it more, right? Like, it's like like you're doing a ton of work, and then someone says, "Hey, there's this like amazing project that's coming up, and we're doing this," and then that's like people are just like, "Yeah, count me in," and I'm like, sometimes we shouldn't even mention it around certain people because we know that they're going to say that and we don't want to like control folks. But like to me, those are like examples of like recognizing who we are and how we're showing up. And that person who's always offering to do something, um, right? And to support, like, how do we take that initiative and not in a way that's like controlling or anything, but realize that like, hey, no, I got this. I can take care of this. I got you. You know what I mean? So, and maybe that's it. Maybe it's I got you. Maybe it's all boiled down to like I got you. Um, Deborah says grief needs to be sanctioned, and unfortunately, our country has left the bereaved without support. Um, so, all right. All right. I'm gonna keep going. What's the time? Lord, oh my gosh. Whoa. Okay. We literally have like 17 minutes left. How did that happen? Wow. Huh. So let me see here. Yes, these slides are going to be available to folks. Well, there are a couple of things that Jesus, I don't know if I want to cover all these things, but try to cover as much as I can, or I really want to hear from folks. You know what? Let's stop and can we have like question and answer right now, and just like what's really relevant. Like you'll have access to these slides. There's a lot of stuff that's covered in here. Quite frankly, I feel like a lot of this stuff you're gonna know, but there's always opportunity to reach out to me if you want to hear more information about it. If you want to just, connect and like talk. Um, but yeah, I would love to like respond directly and like us respond directly to the needs of each other. So I'll pose that question. Like, what is something that you need right now, right? To support you in your own care, right? And caring for you. What do you need right now? Let's say that. I'd love folks to respond to that. Kind of like impromptu, but that's how the spirit moves sometimes.
Uh,
Hello?
you can go ahead and unmute yourself or use the raise hand function and I can unmute you, or you can use the chat box or the Q&A box.
I would love to hear people's voices. That would be great. It's so good to hear your voice, Anna.
You have a
Okay,
question in the Q&A.
oh, you see the question in the Q&A. So it says, I'd like ideas on how to support anti-SV advocates in nonprofits in trauma-informed and energizing ways, if you have any.
Yeah. Yeah, let's see if we can talk about that. Off the cuff, we can have a conversation about that. I don't want to open up that can of worms unless other folks want to add some things that are working for them. Yeah.
Lena, you're saying that you can't unmute yourself.
Oh,
Just
you know
raise
what?
your hand and I can unmute you and invite you to talk.
Stop sharing. Think that'll help. Okay, we got a bunch of stuff happening in the chat that I missed. I sometimes need to tell myself that it will all be there tomorrow. Ooh, amen, ashe, whatever you want to say to that one, because we definitely need that grace for ourselves and for others. Um, Trauma in the Black, Indigenous, Native communities have commodities where I live. How can I bridge the gap and bring the communities together? Um, yeah, that's another opportunity. I'll put my info in the into the into the chat, and I'll share it as well if we want to connect off this. But these are definitely conversations that we can, I can provide some thought partnership. I don't have all of the answers. One of the things that I'm really grateful for is that, I know people who have different like approaches and strategies to do this that I'm so grateful to sit at their feet and learn from, right? And that's one of the things that I love about the role that I play is that I'm able to like share some of those lessons for other folks. But yeah, Tilly, um, would love to connect with you further about that. I find that therapy needs to be more accessible and affordable for those in the field, therapists, direct care workers, advocates, etc. I love the idea of having an in-house therapist for the staff. Yeah, you know how hard it was for me to find my current therapist, right? And this is something that we're all struggling with, right? Like common justice, we have like a wellness benefit of $2,000 that folks get, and like we even sent out like a list of like uh, therapists for BIPOC folks, and um, man, people were still struggling to make that call. Like it's just, that's the beauty of us, right? And we need to preserve that beauty, right? By sometimes supporting our colleagues, supporting the person who's next to us, and like, maybe taking that step. And it wasn't, if that's what happened to me. I had a friend say, look, I'm going to help you call this person and connect with this person. And they took that extra step with me because I put forth a little effort, but then when it wasn't happening as quickly as I needed it to, because I was still worried about all of the 5,000 other things that I had to do, I let it go, right? That's the other thing too, right? Like, under these circumstances, everyone is like kind of doubling up. I don't know about you, but like during COVID, work ramped up. It ramped up in so many ways. Um, and people had so much more access to you via Zoom. People in your living room, people in your bedroom with Zoom now, right? So you can't even escape in your home and have some moments. um, Great. I don't actually have anything I want to say right now. I just thought it was true that we couldn't undo. Honestly, I feel overwhelmed thinking about what I need. I need the world to literally rewire itself. Woo! Amen. Ashe. Um, some Indian boarding schools are still pending environmental cleanup. Exposure to lead-based paint causes behavioral problems, and this was forced. I crashed and burned on a project like this that lacked management support. I think maybe more awareness would help. Thank you. Thank you. Um, Agreed with 100%. Alpana. Let me see that one. The fact that trauma that POC experience are um, criminalized impacts our ability to be open to support. Um, Open to support. Support feels like judgments. Yeah. And we don't need any more of that. I appreciate your discussion and openness. Thank you. Yeah, that judgment piece is huge. That judgment piece is huge. Like one of the things that I've been kind of like pushing back on it, even if the use of like the term survivor is like people of color, right? It's like, um, I don't know, just I don't know about your experiences, but like there was no space for us to be a victim. I understand how survivorship is like empowering, right? Um, but like there was no space to like be vulnerable and be a victim and say I'm hurt, right? And it was just like we're survivors. We got to keep moving. We got to keep pushing. We got to keep going, right? Instead of saying, "Man, I'm hurt and I want to sit still for a minute. I don't have the energy to get up." And so that judgment is real because it's rooted in like if we're trying to like save space and like all of these other things are against us, all of these other strikes are against us, and we know we got to work. You know the sayings that people say like, you got to work twice as hard. I never forget starting my doctoral program, and like some black folks were saying to me like, you got to work twice as hard. I'm like, why are we still using that language to put that additional burden on ourselves, right? Why? Um, anyway. Um, the community care and care for the folk around me, I do a lot of offering support and offering specific help. When I'm feeling heavy with the work, I can't think of anything that would help me. So I offer to make a phone call or ask, what do you need from me to make sure you do this? Like with taking an afternoon off or asking someone else for help. Um, Thank you for saying that, Kyra. Um, And the last thing we say is need to grieve some more. Um, I'm not able to see all of the names, but yeah, Michelle said that. Able to grieve some more. Um, so yeah, I think there's this one quote that I'm gonna say. Probably have heard this quote. I love this quote, and it was really helpful for me. Um, And again, it goes back to the fact that like women of color, queer folks, trans folks have been like on this for a very long time, acknowledging the importance for um, being equally committed to our own healing journey while we try to create the world that we want to live in. Um, I'll just say it. You can see it. Share screen, boom. And it's from Audre Lorde. I just wonder if I'm saying it right correctly. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I love that. And that's all I got. So thank you all for joining. I can, um, if anyone have any last minute things they want to share, that'd be great.
Thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today. We still have a few minutes, so I invite folks to submit questions or discussion points or anything that you want to talk about before we leave. You have a few minutes to do so. If not, we can release you from the last 15 minutes, Richard.
Huh? Oh, is that, I'm gonna put my contact information in here. Yeah, take that last 5 minutes and wait, 15 minutes or 5 minutes? What?
Sorry, 5 minutes. Did I say 15 minutes? See, I still want you to
I was
stay.
telling you first, so we got 15 minutes left. For 5 minutes, yeah, everyone go do something. Take that 5 minutes. I don't know, that doesn't even matter. Like 5 minutes.
You don't have to stay. I was just giving people some time to think through questions or process things.
I'm gonna stay on until they leave. All right.
All right, I think,
Think we're good?
yeah. lot of thank yous are coming on the chat, so I don't want you to miss that. All right, so I think we can end here. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today and for all the knowledge you shared with us. It's really appreciated. And, you know, even though we didn't have a lot of people coming in and talk, but we had a lot of lively chat, and that was really appreciated too. So thank you for everyone who participated today. And the recording and the PowerPoint will be available to you all. I'll email it to you shortly. And thank you again, Richard, and thank you for our interpreters and our closed captionists today for your help. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.